And not only from a physical and physiological standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, because most of these females that have come to me, and probably you experience this too, Astrid, is it's that cyclical dieting, right? Oh, I'm gonna diet for 8 weeks, and oh, I'm not happy. I'm not toned enough. I'm gonna diet longer and longer. It's like, no, that's not the answer. The answer is you need to eat more food. You need to train harder for an appreciable amount of time, probably upwards of a year or more before you do a fat loss phase.
And welcome everybody to a new episode of Astrid Live. And I am going to be speaking today with someone who is very, very special. It's someone that I really, really enjoy talking with and training with. When I was in the US, it was really, really cool. And today we're actually talking about training to getting shredded and how to train appropriately, how to design your own training program, how to know when you're training right, and certain things that are probably things that you ask yourself or are wondering all the time. So I'm going to wait until Paulie joins me and we're going to be getting ready to have a nice chat. And the main idea for this is to take this video and get it to YouTube as well, so you guys can go over there and watch it anytime and repeat all the questions that probably are going to be into the timestamps, so you can go straight to those. Let's get ready to rock and roll. How are you?
I'm doing well. Doing really good. Just spent the last few days at my gym, the bar, called the bar. Laying turf, new flooring, ordered a bunch of new equipment that will probably show up between now and the end of the year, and just, onboarding new clients with BioLane. That never stops, which is amazing. So I look up to you as a coach, Astrid, because I know you've been with BioLane for a little bit longer than I have, and you've been doing an amazing job, and we're blessed to have you on the team.
I am thinking the same with you. You have been such an amazing addition to the team, and it is such a pleasure to have met you. And the reason why I have you today here is to get to know you a little bit more and ask you questions.
I'll answer.
All right. So the main question for me is to know you a little bit more, and I think the audience would love to hear your background. So what is a little bit of why do you do what you do now? And also what made you decide you wanted to be where you're at right now with being a coach, to do training and do everything you do?
Yeah, so that's kind of, I'll explain it as quickly as possible. It's kind of a long story. So I have 3 degrees. I have my first degree I received back in like 2005, my associate's in marketing and sales. And then I decided to further my education and go for my business and finance background. And I also played Division I rugby at that particular time. And that's really where the dynamic shift happened, not only from a professional standpoint, but from like a fitness standpoint. Being involved with the rugby team, having some structure, playing in a Division I sport, which was really amazing. And then, when I graduated from my undergrad degree, I really didn't know exactly kind of what I wanted to do. So I ended up working in kind of the workforce, so to speak, a desk job, a marketing consultant, doing cold calls, meeting, potential clients and things like that. And it really wasn't what I wanted to do. It wasn't fulfilling. It wasn't really challenging. And so then I kind of branched off and went back into retail. So fun fact about me is I used to be an archery bow technician for about 14 years growing up through junior high and high school. So I went and managed a retail store for about a year in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And about 9 months into it, I really did not enjoy working out, basically 60 to 80 hours a week, and just not having a very good quality of life, and not able to continue, some of the things that I like to do, such as lifting weights and, being active outside. So I decided to go back to school, and that was a long process of taking the GRE, applying, and all that kind of good stuff. So I went back to school for my master's degree in nutritional science at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So I moved back to kind of my hometown, and I really enjoyed it. And I got roped into selling personal training for a gym, believe it or not. So a very high-end club in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, very affluent area. My responsibility was essentially to, do wellness consulting. So I would talk with, existing members, new members, talk about their goals. It was truly to get to know them. and they had like, they wanted me to sell supplements and stuff with it. And I didn't really push those. I really wanted to get to know the members, because when they'd see you in the gym, they'd be like, oh, hey, Paul, hey, Susan, or whatever the name is. And so I ended up selling like $10,000 to $15,000 worth of training per month in the gym. And I started to notice like all these trainers that were at the gym, they weren't working. Like, and what I mean by that is they weren't working to get new clients, because I was fucking filling their schedule for them. So all these trainers, there was 4 or 5 trainers, and their schedules were filled with clients. And I'm like, well, they got, I'm doing this for them. This is pretty lucrative. So I decided to, I decided to go to the owner of the gym, and I said, well, I got 2 options for you, Michelle. Her name was Michelle Pearso. Either you can, grant me, commission on my sales, or you can pay for me to get my personal training certification, and I can be a trainer here. And so she opted to go that route. So in 3 months, I kept on, with my job of, doing wellness consults and stuff. But at that time, when I knew I was going to be a trainer, I didn't end up filling the other trainer schedules. I backfilled my schedule. So when I took the test, I hit the sales floor, or the gym floor, excuse me, after the sales room with a full client load. So I was training 30 to 40 hours a week when I stepped into personal training. So that was really kind of cool. And the other trainers are kind of pissed at me, but I was giving them basically free money, because they didn't have to, they didn't really have to fish. They didn't underline in the water. So, and they were good trainers too. I mean, they rebuked, and that was part of their deal. But at any rate, that's kind of where everything stemmed, like from rugby, being very physically active in a Division I sport, and then kind of going through some real world experiences and evolving. And that's something I think people watching this can probably take away. Like, you're going to continually evolve. And so I've owned my own business, my training business, like 3 different times. I've started at 3 different times, primarily due to relocation, because I lived in, Wisconsin, Minnesota, now in Montana. And now I recently just opened up a 3,000 square foot facility with the best equipment you could possibly imagine. Some of it isn't here yet, but the reason I do what I do is because, number 1, I'm a people person, but number 2, I'm confident that my methods can help, clients unlock that potential that they've been looking for, and not from a motivational standpoint, because that's really kind of a short-sighted way of thinking about longevity and sustainability. It's more of like identifying why somebody is participating in something, but also creating a recipe that's going to keep them engaged, right? So, if your objective as a trainer is just to make somebody sore or tired, like, that's easy, but to keep them engaged is something completely different. And so, and not to say that I haven't gone through trial and error, lost clients, got new clients, things like that, and I'm continually learning, but I really enjoy what I do because it's fulfilling. It's challenging for me every single day. It's like I solve problems every day. Some of those are psychological problems, talking with clients, and some of those are business problems from starting my business again, and it's exceptionally successful. I've been very blessed. So I do what I do because, number 1, I like being my own boss. Number 2, I like helping people untap their potential that they haven't tapped into yet, and really just kind of the challenge behind it. So that's kind of the main driver. Every day is different, which is really amazing. So, and then was it December, I applied for Team BioLane. I had I just saw it on my Instagram. I'll just throw my hat in the ring, because I work for a clinic or whatever. And it's like, I'm just going to throw my hat in the ring. I'm probably not going to get interviewed. They'll probably just say I would look for other candidates. But I ended up getting the job, which is like, oh shit, what do I do now? I have this offer. So I'm really glad I did it, because there was a point where I went through that 3rd interview with Holly Baxter, because she was kind of the final step in the process, where, they sent me the letter, and I'm like, uh-oh, now I really have to decide. And for those of you watching, I was very comfortable. I have a very successful training business. I worked as a coach, a wellness coach at a clinic. And so I was comfortable. I was good, right? But there's that voice in me going, I preach all the time to clients and just people who maybe follow me. When you take that step and you feel uncomfortable and it's scary, you've taken the right step. So that's kind of how I knew I was going in the right direction. And so I came on Team BioLane, and I'm pretty rough around the edges. I'm not, I have a trucker mouth. I grew up in a military family. I'm very structured. I'm very prompt. And that's just me. And some people gravitate toward that, right? And so it's just been kind of this full circle thing where I've been in this industry for 15 years, and during my infancy stages, I'm like, well, it shouldn't be this hard. And it's it's always that hard. You're always reinventing yourself. You're evolving. You're continually evolving, right, Astrid? I'm sure that's something that you found out, working through trial and error with clients online or in person. You're always evolving to become better, and you're always a steward and a student rather of your industry, and of your own business. And so that's kind of what gives me the initiative to get up every morning. Is well, how can I unfuck myself today, and how can I help somebody today? So it's kind of like this Neapolitan mix of things that I go through every day that make my life super enjoyable.
It's awesome. I feel so much connected to what are you saying, because it's really true when you know that there are so many people out there that benefit from your words, your encouragement. Every time they listen to your perspective, they actually understand or see things differently, and that can change the day of like how they're going through the day. And you say, no, it's actually this way. Or probably you should be looking with this perspective rather than the way you're looking at those things. And sometimes I really encourage my clients to kind of zoom out and look at things bigger picture, and understanding that sometimes certain situations may seem endless or really, really bad. But at the same time, when you zoom out and really look at the bigger picture, that is just a tiny black hole in the big area. And when you understand and see that with that different perspective, things change. And oh, that's true. What I just need to do is maybe just change my mindset, and perhaps focus on the positive things, or just in the things that I can do, rather than just react to this tiny thing that is probably uncomfortable or I don't like it. But back to you, Paul. One question I always have wondering is, how do you get into deciding one day out of nothing, I want to compete in a bodybuilding? So what happens? What happened there?
Yeah, so that was back in 2006. I was working out at University of Wisconsin-Stout, where I was completing my undergrad degree, and one of my teammates on the rugby team had competed a couple times, and he was exceptionally well put together, trained very hard. He was my training partner, by far the best training partner I've had to date. His name's Braden Soul. He's since retired from professional bodybuilding and now is a nationally recognized strongman competitor. But he encouraged me to. He's like, I'm competing in the spring next year. Like, I think you would do really, really well. You've got a lot of muscle mass. You train hard. You've got the work ethic. I think you should try it. And so I did. And it was really kind of a cool experience. Like, he didn't like prep me or anything. I kind of did my own prep. I look back at those pictures today and go, I had no business being on stage. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was in shape, right? But that's where your perception of lean is forever skewed when you actually get to a world championship stage, like I did a couple of years ago, and compete and look back at like where you started. And that's part of that evolution. That's part of that process, right? So it was more of an encouragement from my buddy who I played rugby with. And since then I've been kind of hooked. I haven't competed in a few years, and I'm not sure I'm going to compete again because I've done it for 17 years or so, pretty close to. But that's how it all began.
Okay. Well, talking about getting lean and getting shredded and jacked and huge, the main other question I want to ask you is, when it comes to hypertrophy, how much more do you need to eat to make sure you actually grow muscle, and sort of trying to minimize that fat gain? Because it's a very fine line to get enough, but not too much, so things are not going to the wrong direction.
Yeah. So I think there's some context there too, because obviously it will depend on that particular individual. So when I started bodybuilding competitively, I was also, playing rugby. And so I had a hard time keeping weight on. So my dietary behaviors at that point were like, Busch Light beer and pizza. And so, fast forward to now, I'm 37, and that's not that's not what I do anymore. So it's a little bit more structured. So from like a muscle gain standpoint, hypertrophy specifically, you really don't need that many additional calories to pack on lean body mass. Slight surplus of 200 to 300. Of course, that's a range. It's not going to be perfect for everybody, but 200 to 300 is probably going to be a good starting point, because you have to think, like, the more body fat you put on, the more body fat you're going to have to strip off at some particular point, especially if you're going to compete. So if you had, you always heard about the bro bulk or the dirty bulk, where they just eat everything in sight. Well, contextually, if you think about lifting weights, you actually spend more time in the gym resting than you do lifting. Like, your working sets are like 30 seconds to maybe 45 seconds. And, if you do 3 of them, that's less than 3 minutes, but you spend 3 minutes resting between each set. So it's like 3 minutes of working to 9 minutes of resting for one particular exercise, possibly. So you really don't exert that much energy lifting weights. But back to minimizing fat gain, if you start tracking your calories and, you go in a modest surplus of, let's say, 300 above maintenance, start to pay attention to that data. What's going on? Not only like the scale. I think that's a decent indicator. I think it's a pretty poor indicator overall. Looking at things like your strength, your progression, your sleep, your recovery, how you manage stress, central nervous fatigue, those things. But there's really no advantage to eating 1,000 calories over your maintenance versus 300. The only advantage is you eat more food, your grocery bill is higher, and when you're done with your dirty bulk, you have significantly more body fat to lose. Yeah. So you want to set yourself up for a simple transition into a fat loss phase. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people recognize. I hired Peter Fitchton when I did World Championships back in 2020. And I had always struggled with, in the off season, getting too big. What I mean by that is I struggled to add size, right? I generally hover 15 to 20 pounds above stage weight, which, I'm 6'4" and I'm about 200 pounds on stage. So I would always hover between 215 and 220, and I'm still pretty relatively lean. I feel good. I perform well. But, multiple coaches that I've had, they said, you need to be fluffier in the off season. I'm like, okay. So I did a full year of calorie surplus work. And I got up to 235 pounds. My heaviest was 242. That was years ago, but I got up to 235, and I was eating between 48 and 5,000 calories, which sucked. It's absolutely awful. It was a full-time job. And the cool part about it is I was my absolute strongest. I pulled some heavy weights. Training was fun. Recovery is great. The eating portion, we got old pretty quick. But the quality of improvement in my physique was significantly better when I dieted down, and I spent a year to diet down, 42 weeks, so just under a year. So it was amazing to actually go through that process and just kind of open my eyes to the benefit of, it's okay to be in a calorie surplus. And you need to, especially for my frame, because I'm bigger than your, average bodybuilder in terms of height. So I needed to absolutely do that. So that makes sense.
Yeah, let me ask you something. So do you think you need, when you did that long year of surplus, how much was for you that surplus? Was like a range, or were you targeting a specific number for you that was kind of the same every single day? Was it changing depending on the rate of gain, or were you expecting to put on quite a lot of body fat? What were the expectations when you did that?
Yeah, so we aim for about a pound of body fat per month. Sometimes maybe a pound and a half. And we didn't, and the unfortunate part for everybody that's in a bulking phase is it's not sexy. You take pictures, but you see yourself going the opposite direction. And a lot of times you don't really see improvements in your physique, right? Because, when you're at 25% body fat is a hypothetical number. When you go to 27, you just see more body fat, essentially. You don't see the actual muscle. So we have to focus on other variables. So we would add food weekly, but those bumps in food are no different than the bumps in food you get during a fat loss phase. So we might bump food up like 150 calories, which is pretty nominal. That's like a serving of peanut butter. It's really not significant, but over the course of the week, it adds up. And so we kind of play with rate of change. I kept my steps. Cardiovascular health is always important. So my steps were naturally 8 to 11,000 per day to begin with. So I wasn't like this anti-cardio bro where I just sat on the couch and ate ice cream. That's completely irresponsible, and you absolutely should prioritize cardiovascular health as well. But it was an interesting process. I think everybody should go through it. You absolutely should spend more time at maintenance or in a surplus than a deficit, regardless if you're competing or not.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one question that I wanted to ask you, perhaps to see your views on, when we are trying to determine your ideal weight, kind of to maintenance weight, especially when you're gaining muscle, or even if you're not necessarily trying to put on muscle, but you are in a slight surplus here and there, how do you know that your weight is no longer the one you used to aim for when you didn't have muscle? Because you always are trying, I don't know if it makes sense, the question, but let's say I have been for a long time 68 kilos. That's one example. But okay. I used to weight, for me, my normal was like 60 kilos. But over the years, I've kept training really hard. I haven't been in a deficit that much. I've been pretty much in maintenance, a slight surplus, and I've kept training my heart off for all this time. So when I go back and see that I've put on muscle, it's not it's not realistic to try to aim for a 60 kilos that I used to weigh before when I actually have put on mass. So my question to you is, how do you determine what would be your new ideal body weight based on the mass you have put on? Does that make sense? I think it's I don't know if it's a complicated question.
No, so like if you start a building phase at 60 kilograms and you end at 68 kilograms, and this is common, so this is a really good question. People will want to go back to their pre-bulk weight of 60 kilograms. Well, that would be like saving $2,000 for a rainy day and then spending $2,000 on that rainy day. Like, you don't, like, the point is to, do a building phase and then peel body fat off and be in a better position and potentially heavier with more lean mass, right? So there's some ways to go about, I think, doing that. Number one is to not fixate on a particular number. And I work with a few elite cyclists, and this was a conversation I had with one of them, and they were stuck on this number. I need to get to this number for performance, or just, I think psychologically it was helpful. And I'm like, well, great. We're going to go through a building phase for the next 12 weeks to 16 weeks. And you might be 2 or 3 pounds heavier than where you were when you started, but you might be leaner, which would be leaner in the context of more lean mass and also less body fat at the end of like your cut phase. So we go through a build phase, we get them person from like 154 pounds to 160 pounds, and then we cut them to 158, and they're stronger, they have more muscle, they're leaner. So like the idea is when you go into a fat loss phase, you probably want to be heavier than you were when you went into your building phase, right? So it's hard to, and that's really where the kind of the nuance and detail come into play. That's why it's important to spend more time at maintenance or on a surplus. So like when you're done with a surplus, you could even, a lot of people can bump back down to just below maintenance and not change anything, and their weight will naturally, their body fat levels will naturally drop off. And then you can add cardio if you need to or whatever. And then you can assess and be like, okay, what things have changed? Well, we can visibly see we've put more size on, your legs or your shoulders or your glutes. We can assess their strength training, how we're not only recovering, but how are you performing in the gym? If there's an increase in output in that capacity, there's a pretty good indication you probably have more lean body mass than you did when you started. And the thing that, females are notorious for this, and I pick on females, and it's not like this is not like to discredit their efforts or anything, but you can't take away something from nothing. And I made a post about this. So, I'll assess a female by their body composition pictures during the onboarding process, and they're like, their goal is to lose body fat. It's like, well, then you'll have nothing left. Like you don't have a baseline. Like we need to establish a baseline. You need to eat more calories. You don't need to eat 5,000 more calories. You simply just need to eat a little bit more food and put some time in the weight room. And it's magical what weightlifting and some extra food can do. And not only from a physical and physiological standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, because most of these females that have come to me, and probably you experience this too, Astrid, is it's that cyclical dieting, right? Oh, I'm gonna diet for 8 weeks, and I'm not happy. I'm not toned enough. I'm gonna diet longer and longer. It's like, no, that's not the answer. The answer is you need to eat more food. You need to train harder for an appreciable amount of time, probably upwards of a year or more before you do a fat loss phase. And I think that's the hardest buy-in to get from a female client, is to trust that particular component of the process.
It is so hard. It is really hard because you have been programmed in your mind that you need to continue in a very steep deficit to lose body fat because you're not comfortable in your own skin to begin with. So when you come to your coach, you want to give them orders to get you to a fat loss phase. And when you come in with another direction, it's like, what?
Yeah.
How do you expect me to eat more if I don't want to put on weight? So when you start, especially if they agree to that and they decide to get on the process, initially they just freaked out, because when they start seeing the scale go up, initially, because it's going to go up, initially you're just eating more food, you're eating more carbohydrates, you have more glycogen. It is going to happen naturally, but not necessarily because it's fat. It's because your body's used to be hungry all the time and not get all the carbohydrates you need to actually perform better in the gym. And it is going to be a natural bump in the scale. And the worst thing is that when you rely so much on the number on the scale, and the next day is higher, it is so traumatic for them that it's just like a ongoing battle back and forth. You need to trust the process. This is going to go well. You just need to stay there, stick with that, believe on your on the bigger picture, not just
Yeah.
on the right now. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Well, I have a gal who, and that's one thing you don't want to focus on is the scale particularly. I had a gal, she was telling me some symptoms of, GI upset, some bloating, clothes are fitting tightly, and we were in a very slight surplus. And she bought in, right? Because for the remodel, she actually stayed the same exact weight, but her body composition changed dramatically. And that's where pictures really play I think they're a catalyst for success in getting buy-in is showing them the progress. But, it's the high fiber wraps, the net carb wraps, and the protein bars. And I've been doing this long enough to know. So I asked her, I just said, are you eating these things? And she's like, you must be fucking psychic, because these are two things I eat regularly. Because I looked at her fiber, and her fiber was like 60, and she was eating like 2,100 calories. I'm like, how the fuck are you getting 60 grams of fiber with 2,100 calories, right? And I'm like, stop eating that shit, and your GI upset will diminish. So bump your water intake and quit eating those fucking protein bars. They're candy bars. They're just candy bars. So sure enough, she stopped doing that. She said, oh, I feel better. I'm like, duh. I didn't say that, of course, but you look, that's why we track that data, right? You look at it, it's like, oh, you're 5 or 60, your calories are 2,100. What the fuck's going on, so.
Now, another question that I really had for you is related to training.
Yeah.
And I guess it is an interesting question that many may come up or get across when they are starting to get across the RIR or the reps in reserve or the RPE, when you're trying to sort of know how hard should you train. And
right.
Every single time you go to the gym, or obviously you always want to train hard, and every single week you want to put in your maximal effort so you're actually getting something out of the weight room. But how is it different? How do you feel and know that this week is going to be hard, but probably not as hard as next week, because I want to obviously don't max out the first week I am training, but I'm still training hard. Does that make sense? How do you know that if you're training 5 RIR, is that hard enough for you to do that the first week, and the second week you do the same exercises, but now it's going to be 3 RIR or 3 reps in reserve, and that is still hard enough, and then you kind of go up to when you're just kind of training around 1 to 0 RIR, and then you start kind of bumping back down to kind of a deload phase, and then you end that mesocycle. Does that make sense, a question?
Yeah, so it depends on the lifter. Most novice lifters don't need to take a deload a week. I would say a majority of lifters probably don't need a deload a week because they don't train hard enough. There's a lot of decision fatigue that can go into really being nitty gritty with RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion. So 10 being like maximum effort, 1 being like no effort. That's rate of perceived exertion. Well, reps in reserve is the inverse. 10 would be, you could do 10 more repetitions. 1 would be like maybe 1 more rep or failure. So I've used both for clients. Progression with strength training is interesting because it's like and I'll explain something here in a moment, but like, it's like you go up this flight of stairs, you go 3 steps up and then you take 2 steps down, and then you go 1 step up, 1 step down, 3 steps up, a step down. So you're kind of climbing this ladder. A lot of the main compounds are great exercises to use RPE or RIR, but like your accessory work, I generally tell clients, you're not going to progress in every single lift. It's never linear, but you should probably be, increasing your sets, your reps, or your intensity, or a combination of those 3 throughout your training phase, right? So a great example would be, the best way to explain this is I had a particular exercise. It was a chest day. And it was an upper body day because I'm doing a 4-day split right now. So my chest press, I set a PR on. And so it was like a 3-3 tempo, and it was like an RPE of 8.5. I posted a video about it the other week. Well, when I went to like my accessory work, my tricep work, I actually had to go down in weight from the previous week, but I also looked back at the previous week, and what I did for chest press was like 20 pounds lighter. So I fatigued myself for the main compound, so my accessory work wasn't as robust. Right. That's a great trade-off for me. Like, I could give a shit about what I could tricep press down. Like, that to me isn't super important. I mean, it is important to build, like a movement like a press overhead or, a chest press. But my goal is to make my chest stronger. So it's kind of like this love-hate relationship with your accessory work and your main compound. So some weeks your accessory work will be stronger. Some weeks your compounds will be stronger, and the inverse, So it really just kind of depends on you as an individual. For most people, I would say, you know, and there were some studies, and I know I talked to Lane about this as well. You know, and I think this is in reps. So if you haven't subscribed to reps, go subscribe. But you know, most people, you know, were off on their, I guess, rate of perceived exertion by 5. So they had 5 more reps than they thought in the tank than they actually did. So that is an indication that most people don't train hard enough, and they don't, myself included. So one of the best ways to combat that is video yourself, because what you perceive is different than how the bar or the motor or the pathway of the bar or dumbbells is actually happening. You don't have to buy, you know, some of those devices that you see, the RPE devices that gauge RPE. Those can be helpful, but watch yourself, record yourself on video to see, like, oh, you know. And I shot myself in the foot. I pulled 545 on deadlift several years ago, and it felt hard in my head. But I watched the video; it looked like a 2. I sent it to my coach. He's like, "Dude, was that your max?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "That looked like a warm up." So you have to kind of pay attention to it, and that's where videos can come into play. And so some of my clients, actually all of them, I invite to message me on Instagram, send me a video of you lifting. And I've had a few of them tag me RPE of 8, and I'm like, that's not a fucking RPE, that's an RPE of 5. Like, add more weight to the bar, you know. So there's a variety of ways to gauge it, and that's one of my favorites, is to record and evaluate, like look at it, like, you know, because I think there's a lot of things that can go into the perception of how hard the weight is. Like if you've had a psychologically draining day, if you are mentally exhausted from your occupation, or you know, whatever you're doing all day, and you have to go train now, that carries over. Like your mind is already fatigued, so of course, you know, 50% of your 1 rep max is probably going to feel like a boatload, but in actuality, it's probably not as heavy as you think. So
going back to the same question, how do you know, especially with the reps in reserve, how do you know that you actually are 1 or 2 reps away to failure, or technical failure, for example?
It's different for everybody. You will know if you've ever failed. Like, okay, so here's a great example. So I would take maybe like a less risky movement, risky relative, of course. So like something that's less dangerous. Like if you're training by yourself, don't try to go to failure on barbell back squat. That would be silly, right? Unless you have safety pins set up. Go to failure on like a machine chest press, a leg extension, something, and you will know what failure absolutely feels like. People think failure feels like their muscles are slightly burning. No, you have just, once you feel your muscles start to burning, you have maybe passed the 6 RPE or 7 RPE, right? So you have a lot more potential in the tank. So go test a true failure using a piece of equipment that's less risky in terms of like getting injured if you're training by yourself, and you'll absolutely know what failure feels like. And this is what I've talked to my clients about, you know. If you haven't changed any of, like, if 50% of your weights haven't changed your training program, you're not training hard enough. So you need to absolutely not be afraid of failure. I would much rather have somebody attempt a new weight and miss their rep prescription that I've given to them than them to stay comfortable in their bubble and not move their weight up because they're afraid to fail. Like, I can promise you, you have so much more in the gas tank than you give yourself credit for, and myself included. There would be days where I video myself and like, what the hell, man? Like, you could have done more. Why didn't you? So even experienced lifters have difficulty gauging, RPE or IR. So
when you are determining that failure, how do you know how do you know that you actually can push yourself, because you know what, especially if you're lifting by yourself and you have no one around, you don't have that external motivation that is kind of like, come on, keep going. Like, you start feeling the pain and like, I think I'm in failure. Maybe you don't know how to recognize it, especially if you haven't felt it before. You probably don't even know whether, is this really the failure, or should I go a little bit more? Or like, I'm in pain, I'm suffering right now. If I go further, is it too much? Like, you will be able to recover later.
So for some of your big compound movements, there's 1 rep max calculators. I don't recommend going out and testing your 1 rep max, right? But I think you could probably draw some data from a one rep max calculator to determine, like, okay, maybe I should be working in this, with this amount of weight, or whatever the case might be. Like, there's a lot of tools. A lot of times I'll just assess somebody's video. Like, send me your video of you doing a barbell back squat. I want to see what your perceived RPE of 8 looks like, and I will tell you if that's an 8 or not.
Now, the other thing that I really want to know is when you're thinking about the exercises, and obviously you're looking at someone's form, sort of predicting, well, this is a really good exercise for you because you're performing it well. How should be the progression of getting the right form? Do you start from proprioception, getting the basics right first, then you move to adding some weight? And is that weight probably most appropriate to utilize a machine or maybe a dumbbell? Is it a barbell? What is kind of the progression to getting to like the ideal movement pattern for that particular exercise?
So I think it's important to always have a fundamental movement pattern, a form that is appropriate for that individual. So my segments are different than the person next to me, and they're different than your segments. So segments being the distance between joints and levers and things of that nature. And so, appropriate exercise selection, I think is very important. So once the movement pattern is established and it's done in a way that looks appropriate for the individual, then progression can be a simple form of like, okay, we start to add maybe more weights, more reps, increase the RPE. Sometimes I'll test exercises with clients and I'm looking at their form and something doesn't look right. So for example, like a barbell back squat, okay, well, there's considerable knee valgus or significant forward fold. So maybe let's work on strengthening some other areas, doing some like acute tissue work first, like foam rolling or stretching, and then maybe revisiting that movement down the road, but focusing on something like maybe a hack squat where you're put into a better position where it's more advantageous for somebody to do correctly with a lesser risk of potential injury.
Okay.
So,
for you, is it? Let me reframe the question. It's in my head. So that when you're sore, is it for you soreness a good indication that you train really hard, or should you not get by soreness to determine how hard you trained?
Yeah, so I think like sensory training. So, and there's a lot of debate on this, and I'm not going to get into the nuance of that, but like when you're working a muscle group, you should probably feel that muscle group working. Like if you're doing a bicep curl or a leg extension, you should probably feel those muscles working. Like I think we can all agree that's fundamental, right? But in terms of like delayed onset muscle soreness, which you feel a day or two post-workout, that is a terrible indication of a good workout. Can it be helpful? Yeah, but stop working out for 2 weeks and go back to what you were doing before you stop working out for 2 weeks. I guarantee you're going to be sore. So that's like when people are sick or they go on vacation or something like that, I generally recommend like easing back into a program versus going back into the program where they left off, because you're going to be sore. Soreness is and I know some people are like pump chasers, they chase being sore, and that's really a terrible way to go about, working out, because our bodies are incredible beings and they adapt to stressors. And so a lot of times like being sore is just an indication that you've placed a new stressor on it. And what that could mean is 1 week you've done dumbbell shoulder press or for a couple weeks, and then the third week you do machine shoulder press, and because it was at slightly a different angle, you feel sore in that shoulder or the shoulders. It's like, well, that's great. Doesn't mean it was a better workout. It just means that your setup could have been different. It could have been, there's a variety of factors that could have gone into, feeling sore after switching, dumbbell press to a shoulder press. So it's definitely not a good indication. For those of you watching, I wouldn't be chasing being sore. That's a lot of times you'll get injured too, because you're just working yourself past exhaustion, and then you run into like central nervous fatigue and those types of things, which we don't need to get into today. But yeah, definitely there's no need to feel sore after every workout. And
should you work out if you feel sore?
Yeah, I think that's appropriate. It can actually help with recovery. Getting
How hard should you go though?
Well, your body will dictate that. I can guarantee you, like, if you did legs and then 2 days later you want to do legs again, I guarantee you're going to ease into that like an old person getting into a hot tub. So I think it'll auto-regulate itself in most cases, but you may want to be a little bit conservative on the first or second set. But for me, like mountain biking, the day after I do leg day, I have some of my strongest rides, and my legs feel great. They recover. So yeah, absolutely. If you're sore, work out. The worst thing you can do is sit on the couch. Like that's not recovering. That's just being lazy. Like you need to get up and move. Like that's how you recover is movement. So
how often How often should you train, or should you change your exercises? Every 5 weeks, every 4 weeks? Should you just keep the same movement patterns? Can you do a slight modifications and still be considered roughly the same? For example, from a Bulgarian split squat to a lunge, it's kind of the same pattern, but you're just modifying the sort of the way you're doing it, but it's kind of similar. How do you go about deciding which exercises are appropriate and how often modifying them or alternating them?
Yeah, I would definitely, I think there's a time and place, like when I'm working with clients, that I'll ask for feedback. Like if there's an exercise that you're doing that's not jiving, explain it to me. Like when you're checking in with me, let me know, and we can switch it out. It's a simple fix. But if you're following a program, I would absolutely follow that program through if those exercises are jiving with your body mechanics and they're working for you. I think we get caught up with social media and like being creative with exercises, and you end up treading water when you change exercises too frequently, because you have no way of gauging actual progress. So, I think it's a healthy relationship between the individual and exercise at the end of their, micro and macro cycle of training to look and go, okay, what areas did I get really strong in? What areas do I want to continue to improve? And look at the exercises that keep you engaged, number one, that you enjoy. But I think there's room to add, maybe change exercises in there for like, somebody put on their questionnaire, they don't like Bulgarians. Well, I asked them why. They're like, they suck. And I'm like, well, that's not a reason why you don't like them. Like if you have, if your ACL had just been replaced or MCL, and, that would be a different case. But just because you don't like them doesn't mean I'm not going to program them. That probably means you need them in your program, which is why a lot of guys just do arms and don't do legs because they hate doing legs. Well, newsflash, I was one of those guys. And so I had to play catch up on my leg training. So I think it's important, to stay consistent, right, for a given period of time, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Look at what worked well for you in your training program. Maybe there's an exercise that you liked, but you didn't progress really well in it. So maybe you switch that out. But it's just kind of a puzzle. Like you need to have exercises in there, your main bread and butters, your hinge, your pulls, your pushes, things like that. Curtsy lunges. That's one of the fucking exercises that I've seen forever. It's like, and I see women doing these fucking curtsy lunges and their knee is going like this. It's like, you're not training your glute. Your knee is going to fucking snap. Like if you want to strengthen your glute, do a Bulgarian split squat, do, a reverse lunge and kick your leg straight back. Like people tend to get so fancy with exercises that they lose their proprioception and they have no clue what they're doing. So yeah, it's like, it's interesting, but you have to stay consistent with your program to see if it worked. And you're not like 8 weeks is not a long period of time, right? So I think we can agree that if you stuck 8 weeks out and at the end of 8 weeks you didn't like an exercise, just change it out. But don't change it 2 weeks in just because you want to try something different. Like pick exercises that are going to keep you engaged, that you can stick with for the duration of the program. Then when you're done, you evaluate and then you change a few of those. You don't need to change all of your programming. Like I just got done writing 3 different 24-week blocks, or 3 different programs. Each of them are 24 weeks, but they're 8-week block increments for each client. And I changed several exercises, but I didn't change all of them, because then you have to go relearn all those exercises that you may not know how to complete. So now you're spending time learning the mechanics of a new exercise versus just like, oh, yep, I'm doing conventional deadlift, Bulgarian split squat. Now I'm going to do a superset of leg curl and walking lunge. Okay, great. That's simple, right? So.
Okay, talking about supersets. Okay.
Yeah.
I love doing supersets. It's something that I really, really enjoy. What are some of the pros and cons of doing supersets?
They can be detrimental for hypertrophy, but I think that also is contextual. I think I don't think people have the mental fortitude or the time, like to rest 3 to 5 minutes, 3 minutes between each set. I think 3 minutes is probably the most desirable rest period between each set. I can tell you for clients that I train in my facility, like if they rested 3 minutes between each set, they would probably get really bored and they're just kind of awkward, nothing to talk about for 9 minutes for one exercise. So it's supersets they can be great for a number of reasons. I think supersets can kind of help the individual break through the threshold of actually training hard enough, right? Working toward near failure if you're supersetting a couple exercises, but it's also great for time. And I think time is something that everybody probably wants a little bit more of, and being more efficient in the gym can be helpful. And for isometric exercises, supersetting is wonderful. going from one to the next and then resting. And if you need a little bit longer rest, then rest longer. But yeah, I think, beginners definitely don't need a superset. I don't think there's an advantage there. I think it actually can be more detrimental to completing the exercise for all of the sets and repetitions with adequate form. I think there's a lot of form breakdown for beginners if we start to superset. But it can be also great for cardiorespiratory fitness. I have supersets in my programming right now because my main focus is mountain biking in the summer. So yeah, it's I'm heavily supersetting.
The other question is around working sets and how do you account the warm-up sets? Like, do you account warm-up sets towards your total volume, or should you just count the working sets? How do you know, and on top of that question, how do you know when you're utilizing certain muscles that are not necessarily the main exercise, but you're sort of utilizing them anyways? For example, for a pull-up, you're utilizing part of your biceps, your forearms. Do you count part of that volume, like a quarter of that volume, towards the volume of your biceps when you're kind of programming for biceps? Or like, there are obviously, when we do movements, we're not just isolating that movement on its own necessarily. You're utilizing other muscle groups that somehow are playing a role in the execution of that movement. So how do you know how much of that movement pertains, or you can account for, towards the total volume and the total sets for a week for that muscle? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think it's important to know that your warm-up is just that, it's a warm-up. And if you're exhausted or if you're out of breath after your warm-up, you're not doing a warm-up. You're probably warming up too much. Something as simple as like a 500 to 1,000 meter row on a rowing machine is an amazing warm-up. Like, that's a full body movement. You're getting your quads, your calves, your shoulders, your back, core. I mean, everything's kind of involved. So like your warm-up sets, like, for example, here, and this will kind of lead into your second question, Astrid. So for example, I posted a video of a dumbbell complex warm-up that I've used since graduate school. It's amazing. I love it. It works really well. It takes less than 7 minutes. It's with a pair of 5, 10, or 15-pound dumbbells. So when you're done with your actual warm-up and you're doing your working set, so like, for instance, like a chest press, maybe it's a press day. But later in the workout, I have tricep extension. Well, if it's a pushing day, your triceps are involved with all those primary movements, your overhead, your chest presses, those types of movements, right? So when you get to a tricep extension, you don't need to warm up your triceps before a tricep extension. As you get older, like, and you start to do things like skull crushers and things, you might, do kind of like a conservative set, but like, I'm not warming up halfway through my workout to hit an accessory muscle that was a secondary mover in one of my main movements. Like, I don't have time for that. Like, if your warm-up was done correctly and your training intensity was appropriate, like, you don't need a warm-up later in your workout. Like, that's silly. So, and like, in terms of like, biceps being involved with pull-ups, well, that's just part of being a secondary mover in that exercise. So yeah, it goes into like, okay, and I kind of explained this earlier, like, if I set a new PR on pull-ups with weight, I might notice my, bicep work at the end of the workout suffers a little bit, which I'm okay with. It's not a big deal. Yeah. But we don't want to tax those secondary movers, in efforts to, warm up for a primary mover. Like, that doesn't make sense. So.
But the question also was targeted to when you're designing and programming your actual resistance training program for a block. You always want to account for total volume per muscle group per week, right? So if you're doing certain movements, for example, the compound movements that are going to involve more than one muscle group, should you account slightly for somehow for part of those muscles that were involved within the total volume for that muscle group? For example, if I'm doing back to the biceps, pull-ups. If I'm doing pull-ups, my pull-ups are my main compound movements, are my biggest goal, but I also want to make sure I'm doing enough volume for my biceps if I want to grow them, if I want to define them enough. But when we're seeing that ideally total sets should be between 12 and 20, within those 12 and 20, do you account just for the ones that you're only doing biceps and only working towards biceps, or are you accounting somehow a few sets just because you did involve your biceps doing another compound movement.
I mean, it's definitely, I think it's taken into account with the accessory workout program, but I think it's really difficult to disseminate like what percentage of the biceps is working during a chin up or a pull up. So to answer your question, no, I don't like break down secondary muscle groups, to account for like for total volume. I think it kind of naturally plays out anyway. Like I'm not having people do, in that particular example, 15 sets of biceps in a training session. They might do like 3. And then later in the week, they'll do another 3. But just keeping that into account, like we're doing other pull movements on that day. So yes, your biceps are going to be involved. And then you kind of run into the issue of like trash volume, right? So if I just plan a bunch of bicep movements after a heavy pulling day, they're going to be so fatigued by the time they get to, X set, it becomes, the return on investment is not there.
Okay. Got it. Now, my last question, and I will let you go. I've kept you for an hour.
I got time. You can ask a few more.
What are some of your best tips to design your own program? So, how would you organize the structure of a training program for yourself? Like, is it that does that involve a little bit of a warm up? What should you do for a warm up? You already sort of gave us a little bit of an idea. And then what should you choose for the middle or the main component of your training, and how do you end it?
Yeah, so, my warm-ups are different every day. They're no more than 10 minutes. To be honest with you, if I've been training clients, for 4 hours moving, helping load bars, unload bars, I don't need a warm-up because I've been pushing, pulling, doing those things. So I'll do like a couple feeler sets for like a chest press, and then I'll go into my working set. But in terms of like building a program, it all starts with like what's realistic in terms of frequency for you as an individual, right? So, and I run into this where clients are like, oh, I can do 5 days a week. And then I program 5 days and they habitually miss a 5th day. It's like, well, you said you wanted 5. If you want me to reprogram 4 for you, I'm gonna have to, like, it's not free. Like that takes me time. I have to go back and strip your program down to bare nothing and then rebuild it. So, being realistic, if you have a program that's 4 days a week, but you travel on vacation and you hit 2 days a week, like that's still being consistent. Like that's okay. It's 1 week. It's not going to make or break you. So identifying the frequency, like that's the fundamental foundation of designing your program, because that will dictate total sets each day. So generally 3 to 5 days has been kind of the sweet spot for a lot of people. So looking at how many days a week can you train consistently? What are the areas that you are specifically looking to improve? Do you want a bigger butt? Do you want bigger and stronger hamstrings? Do you want more shoulders? Because I think you can place a little bit more emphasis on those areas when you're building those programs. The meat and potatoes, like I had talked about earlier, you want to have exercises that keep you engaged. And exercises that keep you engaged and exercises that are fancy are 2 different things. And I see this all the time with people who are on social media posting all these fancy exercises. It's like, that's great, but it's complicating the process. Like here's a great example, and I'm actually going to make a post about it this week. A single leg RDL. I have my rear foot planted. So for hypertrophy, that makes sense because the goal should be to activate that glute of the leg that's forward. If I have that rear foot elevated and I'm weeble-wobbling all over, my glute isn't going to get the maximum stimulus it deserves to grow. So you need to pick exercises that are going to keep you engaged, that you enjoy, but that are also challenging. And those might not be the exercises you enjoy. So just kind of know, like, if you don't like a particular exercise, why don't you like it? Is it because it causes pain? Well, then that's a different story. You need to have something assessed. But if it's just something you're not good at, that's not like, then you need to do that exercise to be better at it. Absolutely. So okay. Go ahead. Is that helpful?
Yes, no, absolutely. Wanted to ask you, if you were to program supersets, what are some of the best combinations you like for supersetting? Like in terms of muscle groups, you like programming same agonistic, like same muscles or antagonistic muscles, or do you like doing perhaps something totally different, like chest and back, or something that they're completely different, or upper lower? I don't know.
Yeah, the upper lower is a real treat because you're stimulating blood flow to a lower extremity or upper extremity and then doing the exact opposite for the next exercise. So that will get your heart rate just skyrocketed. So doing like push-ups and then squats, that I never programmed that, but that's just an example. So like Astrid, when we were in Florida training, like I could say with one of the supersets that's one of my favorites is some sort of a hip thrust, a heavy hip thrust with more of a lighter to moderate Bulgarian split squat. And I think you can attest to those absolutely are brutal. And so can Tanya and Jackie. I like, like a push-pull. I like, something like pull up with a push-up or, some sort of a pull-down or a horizontal pull with, a delt movement, a side delt. Those are fantastic exercises to superset. And generally supersetting, you're not going for maximum effort in terms of like load, right? So you're not going to like 1 rep max a squat and then go 1 rep max a press. That just doesn't make sense, right? So you want to be sure that you're appropriating the load for that particular exercise. And I have some pretty cool programs that I've written for clients, and they hate me for it because like each week their supersets grow by 2 reps. And then like by week 5, they're doing a drop set at the end of that superset. And then the next week they're doing a double drop set and a triple drop set. So it's like, it can be a shit show, but it's absolutely, I think, wonderful to get clients outside of the box that may or may not be training hard enough. If you're not training hard enough, supersets are wonderful, at least from my experience. Yeah.
What about myoreps? Are you in love with myoreps?
Super high reps? I'm a fan of like all rep ranges. I haven't used myoreps a lot, but I of course, appropriating the load, like training in all rep ranges, I think is super important. And there's, your muscles cannot count repetitions. They do not know repetitions, but they know mechanical tension. So that 5 to 30 rep range can be great. I actually do program time sets for clients as well. And I get some hate for that. In my small group personal training, we'll do like timed bicep curls or tricep extensions, things like that. And they're absolutely brutal because they'll always overshoot the weight they can do. And so they'll have to drop the weight, when you got to do 60 seconds of a banded lateral raise, like that's not easy. Like if you're doing it correctly, they suck.
Oh my goodness. Paul, you're amazing. And I'm so and I'm so keen to go back and train. It was so good. It was fun. Now, what are some of your future projects you have in your belt?
I can't really talk about those right now, but I've got some. I'm going to keep everybody on their toes. I've got some really cool stuff happening with my facility, and so it just is more of a waiting game than anything. But it's going to be absolutely iconic. At least I hope. And just continuing to work with Team BioLane. The Team BioLane family has been amazing. Astrid, you've been absolutely wonderful and a great coach that I look up to with all of your wisdom, and just keep your eye out on Coach Pauly. Watch some of the stuff I'm doing. Reach out if you have questions. Like I'm pretty productive throughout the week. I'm swapping out for busy, but I will get back to you. I try to make the most out of every day, whether it's business, working with clients, things like that. So. A lot of cool and exciting things. I ordered a lot of new equipment over the last several weeks, so it'll be showing up in the next week to 20 weeks, depending on when the manufacturers get done with them. But yeah, a lot of cool stuff happening. It's going to be one of a kind. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Pauly, you have a great end of your Sunday. It was awesome to talk to you and ask you a lot of questions. I probably have more questions, but it's going to be like 3 hours talking, so I'm going to let you go. And we'll chat in another time and do another one like this. It was so amazing to ask you all of these questions that I had in my head. Like, I have to ask these questions to Pauly. But I will see you soon.